The chandelier light thinned into silver ribbons as I watched my husband lace his fingers through my best friend's hand, the way people link grips at a finish line when they think they've won. Laughter rolled across the ballroom like warm air, too soft to call cruel, until you realized it was aimed at me. Mark lifted his glass and praised Brooke for saving the night, then sent a practiced grin toward my table, as if I were a guest at my own event. The clapping went on too long, a polite storm I sat through with my spine straight and my smile careful. When the noise died, he tossed in a joke about me taking a little longer to catch on, and the room chuckled on cue. Brooke dipped her chin, feigning modesty, her thumb drawing a sleepy circle against his wrist. I inhaled, let the bubbles of my champagne bite, and felt something inside me harden into a clean, cold edge. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you believe in quiet justice done right. I want to know who's out there rebuilding their dignity one choice at a time. Your stories matter here, share them, and I'll read every word. My name is Lauren, and for most of my adult life, I considered myself the safe pair of hands, the woman who could fold chaos into a seating chart and make strangers feel like donors had always been friends. I grew up in a modest split level in Decatur, daughter of a public school teacher who ironed his shirts on Sundays and told me that grace is a skill, not an accident. Mark and I met in our late 20s when his firm underwrote a literacy gala. He arrived in a midnight suit and the kind of confidence that makes a quiet room turn its head. He built condos that rose like glass promises along the skyline, and I learned to make those promises feel like community. We called it partnership, and for a long time, that word was enough to drown out the rest. Money changed the background music, but not the tempo of our home. We moved from a snug townhome to a brick colonial in Brookhaven, upgraded our cookware and the wine we poured, and told ourselves the dog deserved a bigger yard. I kept my work steady, arts education, food banks, because I liked to see exactly where a dollar landed. Mark liked the stage, and I made stages bloom lighting linen timelines no one noticed because they ran like a river. Our daughter Ava knew how to pin a boutonniere by 13 and which shoulders to squeeze when a check needed another zero. We were a family rehearsed in warmth, and I believed rehearsal could become truth if you ran it long enough. Brooke entered my life when we were 23, all elbows and ambition at a cramped networking breakfast, where the coffee tasted like burned newsprint. She was giddy smart, the kind of quick that could turn a crisis into a headline you wanted to read, and we kept each other's secrets like folded notes slipped into a winter coat. When Mark and I married, she stood on my side of the aisle. When Ava was born, Brooke brought lavender oil and insisted on washing the bottles herself. She said we were a 3-person team, and it felt harmless to agree. In a city where friendships are sometimes business cards with cocktails, ours was a porch swing, worn familiar, and always there when you got home. The first ache was so quiet, I almost thanked it for being polite. At a neighborhood fundraiser, Mark poured Brooke's wine before mine and laughed when I teased him, calling it good hosting. Later, at a small dinner, Brooke wore a soft, citrus perfume that had always been my private scent, and when I noticed, she smiled and said, "Great minds." I reminded myself that closeness makes overlaps, and let the thought go the way you wave off a mosquito you hope won't return. Still lying in the dark beside Mark, I sometimes felt his body tilt a fraction away, the distance not enough to accuse, just enough to keep me awake. By morning, my optimism returned like muscle memory, and I stacked chairs, printed name cards, and chose centerpieces that tracked the seasons as if timing alone could hold a marriage together. My father visited on Sundays, ate the roast I oversalted when I was tired, and told stories about the students who still wrote him letters from college. He liked Mark's polish, though he trusted mine more, and he would pat my hand before he left and say, "Remember, Lo, kindness isn't the same as silence." I would nod and carry his words like a folded map I didn't think I needed. Meanwhile, Mark's firm grew bolder, deals sealed over golf and bourbon, and my phone filled with photos of ribbon cuttings where I stood one step behind him with scissors that looked like props. When Brooke shifted from friend to consultant on a big project, it made surface sense. She was good under pressure, and I wanted to believe usefulness was the same as loyalty. The night of the Foundation Gala arrived on a rush of velvet and timelines, and I moved through it the way a conductor counts hearing problems resolve before anyone else hears the discord. Donors hugged me, board members thanked me, and the staff slipped me kind looks that felt like small, warm lights. Then Mark took the mic, and Brooke drifted to his side, her dress like a dropped piece of night, and the room began to lean toward a story I hadn't approved. He thanked her first, called her essential, and made a soft joke about me finally letting go, as if the evening had been rescued from my careful hands. The applause came sweet and simple, and the ceiling seemed to lower an inch, the air thinning into something I had to work to pull into my lungs. I held my glass, watched their fingers lock, and felt the smallest click inside me, like a key turning in a door I hadn't realized was there. And that is where I will leave it for now, at the moment when a room applauds what you know isn't true, and the people you love smile as if you don't see them. The days following that gala pressed down like humid air, heavy and sticky, refusing to lift. I carried on with the tasks I always did, emailing sponsors, finalizing auction totals, returning calls, but every moment felt coated in a residue I couldn't wash away. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages about how successful the evening had been, and I replied politely, though the words burned. No one mentioned the way Mark's hand lingered at Brooke's back, or the laughter that followed his mockery of me. Those details had evaporated into silence, leaving me to carry them alone. Mark came home late 2 nights in a row, the smell of expensive bourbon clinging to his jacket. When I asked about his schedule, he brushed me off with vague talk of investors needing reassurance and deals that couldn't wait. He didn't hide his phone, not yet, but he had started holding it a little closer, his thumb tapping out replies with a smirk I recognized too well. At dinner, Ava asked him why he had toasted Brooke instead of me. Her young voice innocent but sharp. He laughed and told her Brooke had worked very hard behind the scenes. My daughter looked at me across the table, searching my eyes for something I couldn't give her, so I smiled and said nothing. One evening, Brooke appeared at my door with a bottle of white wine and a casual smile, as if she hadn't stood beside my husband under chandeliers while the room clapped for her. I let her in, poured us both a glass, and listened as she recounted the gala's highlights, slipping in compliments about Mark's speeches, his presence, his charm. Her words flowed too easily, practiced in the way only a liar rehearses. She complimented my dress, then added that Mark had insisted she wear a darker shade to balance the photos. I nodded, but inside, the word balance felt like a bruise pressed too hard. The following weekend, Mark arranged a birthday dinner for Brooke at a downtown restaurant. He claimed it was small, just a few friends, but when I walked into the private dining room, I saw balloons tied to chairs and candles arranged in glittering rows. Brooke stood in the center, radiant in deep blue satin, while Mark hovered at her shoulder, his hand resting there, with an ease that made me ache. He raised his glass and toasted her loyalty, calling her the truest friend anyone could hope for. The words sliced me in two. Applause followed. Brooke glowed, and I clapped along as my stomach turned. Later that night, when I asked him why he had gone to such lengths, he shrugged and said she deserved it because she had always been there for him. The way he said it, the emphasis on him, made clear where I now stood. I tried to push the doubts away, but the signs gathered like leaves in a storm, drain clogging, until they could no longer be ignored. At another event, I noticed Brooke wearing the same perfume I had introduced her to years ago, the scent that used to belong to me alone. She laughed when I commented, calling it coincidence, but the sweetness of her tone rang false. Another night, Mark poured her wine before mine again, this time without a second thought. Guests noticed, though no one said a word, their smiles polite but tight. Those little humiliations piled up sharp as glass under bare feet. Nights grew longer. I lay awake beside him, staring at the shadows turning on the ceiling, wondering how many lies had been spoken under my own roof. I replayed moments like evidence pinned to a board. The laughter that died when I entered the kitchen, the glance they shared across a crowded room, the whisper of her voice softened for his ear. I told myself I was overthinking that years of friendship could not be erased by suspicion. Yet my heart beat faster when I imagined them together, and I knew deep down I wasn't imagining at all. One afternoon by the pool, Brooke scrolled her phone and laughed at something she wouldn't show me. "Inside joke," she said, tucking the screen away. The words landed like a stone, heavier than they should have, because we had shared every joke for 20 years, and suddenly I was on the outside. That evening, Mark teased me at dinner about being slow to catch on his smirk, daring me to protest. I laughed along, but my cheeks burned. Later, when the dishes were washed and the lights turned low, I pressed my nails into my palms and reminded myself that silence could be sharper than any retort. The turning point came at another gala, one I had planned meticulously down to the last candle holder. It should have been my triumph, but Mark arrived with Brooke on his arm, as if she were the one who belonged at his side. Guests exchanged glances, some curious, some pitying, but none said a word. I watched from across the room as his thumb traced the silk at the small of her back, her smile wide and practiced, and my heart knew what my mind had been resisting. I tried to pull her aside, murmuring that she was drawing a lot of attention. She tilted her head and assured me I was overthinking, but her smile was too deliberate, too rehearsed. When Mark took the podium, he thanked her first, praising her as if she were the reason the night had succeeded. His voice was warm, his words dripping with charm, and then he looked straight at me. He said she had always been there when I fell short. The laughter that followed sounded distant, as if I were underwater. I held my glass steady, but inside I felt stripped and exposed. And then he reached for her hand, lifting it high, like a crown sealing the spectacle with a gesture that told everyone in the room exactly where his loyalty now rested. The applause thundered, and I stood frozen, my body upright, but hollow inside. In that moment, humiliation threatened to crush me, but something else rose instead, sharp and steady. I watched their hands, their smiles, their confidence, and knew with certainty this wasn't a mistake or a fleeting lapse. It was a plan, a deliberate choice to edge me out, to erase me from the life I had helped build. And while the crowd clapped, I understood clearly for the first time that the cracks had widened into something I could no longer patch. I excused myself, heels striking against the marble floor, as I walked to the powder room. The mirror reflected flawless makeup and a gown chosen with care, but my eyes told a different story. They were harder now, colder, no longer the eyes of the woman who had walked into that ballroom. The shift had begun, though I hadn't yet named it. I pressed my palms to the counter and whispered to myself, barely audible, but certain that this would not end with me broken. When I returned to the room, the applause had faded into conversation, but Mark and Brooke still stood together, hands brushing, eyes bright. He looked at me across the space with a smug smile, the expression of a man convinced he had already won. And in that moment, I understood what he did not, that victory declared too soon is already halfway lost. That night after the gala, I lay awake in our bedroom, the silence heavier than the comforter stretched across my body. The space beside me was cold. Mark hadn't bothered to come home, and the house itself felt hollow, its walls too quiet, as if even the air had witnessed the humiliation. I stared at the ceiling fan, watching its blades slice the darkness in slow rhythm, my chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The echo of laughter from the ballroom still clung to me sharper than any insult, a chorus replaying each time I closed my eyes. Morning didn't soften the edges. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, pouring coffee, arranging breakfast. Though my hands trembled when I reached for the sugar jar, Ava noticed. She watched me across the table, her cereal spoon paused midair. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice carrying more awareness than I wanted her to have. I smiled faintly, assuring her that I was just tired from the event and urged her to focus on her school project. She nodded, but I caught the doubt in her eyes, the way she lingered a little longer before leaving for the bus. When the door closed, I sat at the island with my mug cooling in my hands, my mind running through every moment of the night before. Each detail replayed not to torture me, but to study, as if examining a crime scene. Their glances, the way his thumb traced the silk at her back, the false modesty in her lowered eyes, the timing of his words, all of it felt rehearsed. This hadn't been a slip or a sudden attraction. It was planned, measured, and delivered in front of everyone who mattered. By evening, Mark returned home. His tie was loosened, his expression casual, as if the gala had been nothing more than a business engagement. I asked him where he had been. He shrugged, muttered something about a late dinner with Henry Caldwell and a few other investors, and opened the refrigerator. The lie slid out too easily, but his mistake was assuming I wouldn't notice the faint trace of Brooke's perfume clinging to his jacket when he set it over the chair. I didn't argue, didn't demand. I simply nodded and turned away, gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened. The days turned into a pattern I hadn't chosen. He came home late more often, his excuses thinner, his attention fixed on his phone with a smugness he didn't bother to hide. Brooke started appearing at the house without calling first, breezing in with wine or baked goods as if she were family. Sometimes she arrived before Mark did, and I would find the two of them laughing in the kitchen, voices lowering the moment I entered. If I asked what the joke was, Mark would wave me off with, "Oh, nothing you'd care about," and Brooke would sip her glass lips curled in a private smile. At night, I couldn't sleep. I lay still listening to his even breathing while my mind unraveled the threads of my life. I replayed conversations, revisited moments I once dismissed, and realized how often I had been made the punchline of his charm. Each memory burned now with fresh clarity. His remarks about me being slow, his laughter when others joined in Brooke's coy glances, the way she always seemed to redirect conversations when his jabs cut too deep. What I once believed to be her support now looked like a shield for him, one I had foolishly thanked her for. One afternoon, I stopped by Mark's office under the pretense of bringing him lunch. The receptionist greeted me warmly, but her eyes flickered when I asked if he was in. "He stepped out," she said quickly, then added that Brooke had been by earlier for a meeting. My chest tightened, though I forced my smile to stay in place. I left the bag on his desk, the scent of roasted chicken filling the air, and walked out without another word. On the drive home, my vision blurred with tears I didn't allow to fall, gripping the wheel harder each mile until I reached the house. Later that week, I overheard a phone call. Mark was in his study, the door slightly ajar. His voice was low, but I caught fragments laughter Brooke's name and a promise to handle things before I found out. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall, listening until the sound of his footsteps sent me retreating into the kitchen before he noticed. When he entered moments later, I was slicing vegetables, pretending calm. He kissed the top of my head in passing, the gesture so casual, it made my skin crawl. The weight of humiliation grew heavier with each passing day. At dinners, he continued to belittle me with jokes delivered as if they were harmless, and our friends laughed along, unwilling to see the cruelty. Brooke sat close, smiling, her eyes never leaving him. Even in small gatherings, the dynamic shifted. People glanced at me with pity, whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The life I had built, the reputation I had tended with care, was being chipped away, one smirk, one toast, one staged gesture at a time. One night after Ava had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, with the lights dimmed and the house silent. My hands rested in my lap nails, pressing crescent shapes into my palms to ground me. I whispered to myself, a promise that I wouldn't let them erase me. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, something steadier began to grow, a clarity I hadn't felt before. For now, I kept still, watching, waiting, letting them believe I was breaking. The hardest part wasn't seeing their betrayal unfold in public. It was living in the silence that followed the echo of their laughter, carrying into the corners of my home. Yet as I sat there in the dim light, I realized silence could hold power too. And though they believed they had already written me out of the story, they hadn't yet understood what I was capable of when pushed too far. The morning after another sleepless night, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was neat, my blouse pressed, but my eyes gave me away. They looked different, harder, more awake than before. I realized then that I could no longer pretend not to see what was happening around me. Every denial I had told myself, every excuse I had whispered in the dark, had dissolved. The truth had stepped forward, and it wasn't going to let me retreat again. I began to study Mark more closely. The way he carried himself after work, chest, a little broader grin, a little wider, as though parading an invisible crown. He didn't notice my gaze lingering, because in his mind, I was already diminished, too broken to pose any threat. At dinner, he scrolled through his phone, Brooke's name lighting the screen again and again. I asked if he wanted more potatoes. My voice calm, and he nodded absently, never looking up. Inside, I felt the stirrings of something steady and cold, a clarity that no longer wavered. Brooke grew bolder as well. She stopped masking her presence in our lives, appearing at events with her hand brushing his, her laugh echoing a beat too long. Once she arrived at the house unannounced, holding a pie she said she had baked for Ava's history project presentation. It was absurd, transparent, but Mark welcomed her in, and they stood in the kitchen shoulder to shoulder while I tidied the living room, just to give my hands something to do. Later that evening, Ava asked if Brooke was going to be at all our dinners from now on. I kissed her forehead and told her no, though in my heart I wasn't sure. A week later, Dana, Mark's younger sister, came into town. She stayed with us for a night before heading on to Charlotte, where she worked as an accountant. Dana had always been polite to me, but her loyalty was to her brother. Over wine that evening, she leaned close and whispered, "You know, Mark talks about Brooke a lot lately. Maybe more than he should." The comment stung, but the way she said it, half caution, half admiration, burned even deeper. I smiled faintly, thanked her for her honesty, and excused myself, locking the bathroom door so I could sit alone on the cool tile and breathe until my chest loosened. The silence of the house after guests left became unbearable. I wandered from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, straightening frames, unable to shake the echo of laughter that no longer felt mine. My father visited one Sunday, bringing a stack of his old history books for Ava's project. He noticed the weariness in my face, but didn't press. Instead, as he left, he took my hand and said gently, "Lauren, remember that endurance doesn't mean letting someone break you. It means choosing when to stand." His words stayed with me long after his car disappeared down the drive. One evening, Mark hosted a dinner for several investors. I spent the day preparing, setting the table with polished silver and crisp linens. When guests arrived, I moved with practiced ease, pouring wine, keeping conversation light. Halfway through the evening, I noticed Mark pouring Brooke's glass before mine again. A subtle gesture, yet deliberate. Henry Caldwell, seated across, caught my eye and quickly looked away, his expression uneasy. That moment told me what I needed to know. Others saw it too. They recognized what was happening, though no one dared speak. Later that night, as I cleared the dishes, I overheard snippets of conversation from the patio where Mark and Brooke stood together. Her laughter carried, followed by his low voice saying, "She'll come around. She always does." The words tightened every muscle in my body. I placed the plates down carefully, not trusting my grip. He believed I would fold as I always had. He didn't realize something inside me had already shifted, and I was no longer willing to be the silent witness to my own erasure. I began writing everything down. At first, it was just fragments on loose paper. Times he came home, names he mentioned, places he claimed to be. Soon, I bought a leather-bound journal and hid it in the back of my closet drawer. Each entry steadied me, turned my pain into record, my doubt into proof. My pen moved late into the night, my breath evening out as the pages filled. It became a ritual, one that gave me strength when the house around me felt foreign. Still, the loneliness pressed hard. Some nights, I sat by the window in the dark, watching headlights sweep across the street, wondering how many people lived double lives behind drawn curtains. My heart ached for Ava, who tried to stay cheerful, unaware of the storm closing in. She asked once why I seemed sad lately, and I told her gently that grown-ups sometimes carry heavy things children shouldn't have to. She hugged me tight, and I promised her silently that I would not let her see me defeated. The night of another gala approached, and I dressed with care, pulling my hair back, fastening earrings that had once been a gift from Mark. I walked into the ballroom with my chin lifted, though inside my chest pounded. Mark arrived with Brooke again, their entrance deliberate, hands brushing like a signal. Guests glanced between us, some smiling too tightly, others looking away. I felt every gaze, every whisper. Yet instead of breaking, I felt my spine straighten. Their theater was bold, but boldness without restraint always left cracks. When Mark took the microphone, his voice filled the room, praising partnerships and growth, thanking supporters. He paused, glanced toward me, then toward Brooke, and said, "I couldn't have done this without her." The applause rang loud. I raised my glass, held his gaze across the room, and sipped slowly, letting him see that I was still standing still, watching. In his eyes, I caught the flicker of confusion, the briefest hesitation, as though he expected me to crumble and didn't understand why I hadn't. That moment anchored me more than any vow could. The night ended with the two of them leaning close, their laughter low and conspiratorial. As the last guest left, Mark smiled at me across the room, a smile of triumph, certain that I was beaten. But I walked out of that ballroom knowing he had miscalculated. Grief had hardened into something stronger, and every step I took was one step closer to reclaiming what was mine. I had grown used to the sound of the house settling in the night, the groan of wood, the faint tick of pipes. But lately, I listened for something else. I listened for the moment Mark's breathing deepened, and he slipped into sleep, leaving me awake with my thoughts. That was when I moved quietly through the dark padding barefoot to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water I rarely drank, and pulling his abandoned laptop closer. He had never bothered to shield his habits, convinced I would never question him. That arrogance became the opening I needed. I began small at first. Hotel receipts tucked into folders, dinner reservations charged to accounts I didn't recognize. I took photos of every page with my phone, careful to keep the files hidden in a locked folder under a name no one would suspect. The first time I snapped a picture, my hands trembled, but not from guilt. It was something sharper relief. Proof had weight, and with each captured page, I felt steadier, less like a ghost in my own life. During the day, I carried on as expected. I still poured wine at dinners, still smiled when Brooke arrived at my doorstep, with her endless supply of excuses, still laughed faintly when Mark's jokes came at my expense. Let them think I was unraveling. Let them believe I had given up. I burned a casserole on purpose one evening, watching Mark smirk as Brooke offered to order takeout instead. I kept my eyes lowered, as if ashamed, though inside, I wrote another line in my journal: play smaller. Make them certain. One afternoon, I visited the foundation office under the pretense of dropping off reports. That was where I found Melissa Grant, a longtime board member with a sharp legal mind and a quiet way of watching that had always made me feel seen. She pulled me aside, lowering her voice. "I've noticed Mark moving money strangely through event sponsorships," she said. "It may be nothing, but you should be careful." I met her gaze and nodded, choosing my words carefully. "Thank you, Melissa. I'll keep it in mind." I didn't let her see how my pulse quickened. At home, I cross-referenced what she told me with what I had already found. The pattern emerged slowly but unmistakably: transfers routed through shell companies, deposits landing in accounts under Brooke's maiden name. It was more than betrayal of marriage. It was theft, fraud, and arrogance rolled into one. I wrote down every number, every date in my leather-bound journal. The entries filled pages until I could flip through and hear the evidence rustle like wings. Mark never noticed. He grew bolder with each passing week, answering Brooke's calls at the table, leaving messages in plain sight. Once, as we sat at dinner, his phone lit up with her name 3 times in less than a minute. He smirked when he saw me, notice his voice casual as he said, "Just work." I set down my fork and folded my hands neatly, my smile faint. "Of course," I murmured, and he returned to his screen, oblivious to the storm building inches from him. The hardest moment came when Ava caught me staring at my reflection too long in the bathroom mirror. She slipped inside quietly, wrapping her arms around my waist. "You're stronger than him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My throat tightened, but I forced a calm nod, smoothing her hair with my hand. She went back to her room, and I leaned against the sink, gripping porcelain, until the coolness steadied me. I promised myself then that she would not grow up thinking her mother had folded. At night, I refined my plan. Revenge, I realized, was not one act, but a series of movements, each deliberate, each precise. I would not shout in public, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I would let them walk deeper into the illusion of triumph hand in hand, while I built the ground beneath them into a trap. Patience became my weapon, and silence my shield. I practiced restraint like an art form. When Brooke came by with another bottle of wine, claiming she had a rough day, I poured her a glass with steady hands, listening as she hinted at projects Mark wanted her to advise. My laugh was soft, my reply simple. "That sounds like him." She studied me closely, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but I held my smile light and unbothered. Later, I wrote in my journal, "She suspects." Make the performance smaller. Weeks passed, and the pages filled. I memorized account numbers, cataloged texts, saved emails where they weren't as careful as they thought. I began to see connections stretching beyond their affair threads, leading to investors Mark had double-crossed and suppliers left unpaid. Quietly, I reached out, asking questions, letting people talk. The more I listened, the more fragile his empire looked. What he believed was untouchable was stitched together with arrogance and carelessness. The turning point came one evening at dinner. Mark sat across from me, his phone buzzing with Brooke's name again. He smirked, setting it aside, and glanced at me. "You're quiet tonight," he said. I set down my fork and folded my hands, my smile measured. "Just thinking," I replied, about what he asked, his tone smug. I let the silence linger a moment, then shook my head. "Nothing you'd understand." His laughter filled the room, confident, dismissive. I joined him faintly, though inside I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling again. But this time, I wasn't replaying humiliation. I was mapping the next stage, rehearsing the exact way the curtain would rise when the moment came. No matter how many nights it took, no matter how patient I had to be, the ending would be mine to write. The night of Mark's investor dinner arrived with the weight of inevitability. I chose my dress with care black silk that draped cleanly, understated, yet striking, designed to let me disappear until the moment I was ready. When Mark extended his arm at the entrance, I slipped mine through, wearing the smile he expected. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished silver laughter rippling in waves as servers poured champagne. He greeted his investors like royalty, Brooke glittering beside him in sequins, her hand brushing his, whenever she thought no one watched. I let her shine. The brighter the flame, the faster it burned. Dinner unfolded smoothly at first. Plates cleared, speeches, rehearsed toasts lifted to growth and profit. Mark basked in the attention, every gesture of his hands a performance, every word measured to reassure his audience. Brooke played her part, smiling sweetly at the right moments, leaning close when he paused. From my seat, I watched, listening, letting the rhythm of their confidence build. I waited until the hum of the room settled into the predictable pattern of another evening Mark thought he controlled. Then I moved. The scrape of my chair cut through the laughter. Conversations stalled, heads turned, and Mark's voice faltered as he looked toward me, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Lauren?" he said with forced politeness, "perhaps later." I stepped forward, glass in hand, heels clicking against marble, and let the silence stretch until it tightened around us all. "No," I answered softly, my voice carrying across the room. "Now." I walked to the podium and set my glass down with deliberate care. My heart beat steady, not wild, as I pulled a slim folder from my bag. For 20 years, I began my voice clear. I stood beside Mark Whitfield. I watched him build this company, this empire, while I played the part of the loyal wife, the gracious hostess. Tonight, I think it's time we talk about the truth. Mark stiffened his smile, frozen his hand tightening at the back of Brooke's chair. I opened the folder and lifted the first page. While you were being charmed with handshakes and promises, money was moving. Large sums, 6 figures at a time, redirected into accounts you'll never find on official ledgers. Gasps stirred the room, low but sharp. I held the paper high, numbers printed bold against white. Those transfers landed under the name of Brooke Ellison, the woman sitting at his side tonight. All eyes swung toward her. Brooke's painted smile faltered, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her glass. I turned the next page, flipping it with a crack that carried in the silence. These are receipts, transfers, records of fraud. Every one of them tied to Mark's companies, every one routed through Brooke's accounts. This isn't speculation. This is fact. Phones rose across the room, screens glowing as people snapped photos of the documents. The air thickened, with whispers and shifting chairs. Mark shot to his feet, his voice booming. "This is slander. None of this will stand." I let a small laugh slip cold and steady. "Slander requires lies," I answered. "These are not lies. These are your signatures, your accounts, your carelessness." Brooke leaned forward, her voice breaking. "Lauren, you don't understand. I cut her off without raising mine." "Oh, I understand. You wanted what was mine. You thought stepping into my home, my marriage, my life would make it yours. But loyalty built on betrayal is fragile. And tonight, it breaks." The room erupted. Chairs scraped, voices clashed, investors surged forward, demanding answers. Some called lawyers from their seats, others slammed fists against the table. Mark's face reddened, sweat shining at his temples as he tried to speak over the storm. Henry Caldwell rose from his chair, his voice sharp. "Is it true, Mark? Did you use our money?" The question hung heavy, Mark's stammered words collapsing into silence. And then came the sound I had waited for. Brooke's voice strained with panic. "You said no one would ever find out." She hissed at him loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Gasps rippled again, harsher this time. The last thread snapped in plain view. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Investors shouted, some storming out, others crowding Mark with accusations. Brooke tried to slip away, sequins flashing as she pushed toward the exit, but I stepped into her path. "You wanted my life," I said quietly, "only for her. Now you can share his ruin." Her face paled, eyes darting to Mark, who stood cornered by furious partners. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I stepped aside, letting her walk straight into the storm she had helped build. Security arrived to calm the uproar, but the damage was already done. Lawyers were being called, partnerships severed in real time. Mark lunged toward me, his face twisted with rage, but two men blocked his path. "You're finished," one of them spat. He shouted over their shoulders, his voice ragged. "You'll regret this, Lauren." I lifted my glass from the podium, raised it just enough for him to see, and met his eyes. "Remember when you called me slow?" My smile was steady. Looks like I caught on just in time. The room roared again, not with laughter this time, but with the sound of a man's empire collapsing. Cameras flashed, investors turned their backs, and Brooke's sequins disappeared into the crowd. I gathered my folder, tucked it neatly into my bag, and walked toward the doors. Behind me, Mark screamed my name, his voice echoing through the marble hall, like a man already undone. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around me, sharp and clean. My steps were slow, deliberate, the sound of chaos fading behind me. For the first time in months, I breathed without the weight of humiliation pressing against my chest. The war he had started ended not with my silence, but with his downfall. By sunrise, word of Mark's collapse was everywhere. The local business section carried his photo face twisted mid-shout, while my own image at the podium appeared beside headlines about fraud and betrayal. Partners scrambled to distance themselves. Investors froze accounts. Phones lit up with subpoenas. Within days, his once gleaming office downtown sat locked and dark, his name removed from the etched glass doors. I poured my coffee each morning at the kitchen island, the paper spread before me, watching the empire he had built on arrogance and deceit crumble faster than I could have imagined. Brooke fared no better. Her name, once whispered with admiration at galas and luncheons, now appeared in bold print beneath accusations of complicity. She tried to claim ignorance, but the very words she had hissed in panic at that dinner, "You said no one would ever find out," were already circulating among those who had heard them. She was subpoenaed within the week. Friends who once orbited her like satellites stopped returning calls her invitations ignored. I saw her house emptied piece by piece, a moving truck swallowing the furniture while neighbors watched from porches with thin smiles. They turned on each other quickly, faster than I thought possible. Brooke leaked texts and emails, desperate to paint herself as a pawn. Mark retaliated with recordings and receipts, every shred of evidence meant to drag her down beside him. Two people who once mocked me shoulder to shoulder now shredded one another, publicly clawing for air. I didn't lift a hand. I didn't need to. Their unraveling played out in real time, and all I had to do was watch. The knock at my door came late one evening. I opened it to find Brooke standing there, her sequins replaced by a plain cardigan, her makeup gone. Her eyes were hollow, her voice cracked. "Please, Lauren," she whispered. "You have to believe me. He lied to me. He used me." For a moment, I saw the friend I once trusted, the woman who shared my table and held my child when she was an infant. But then I remembered her smile as Mark belittled me, her hand resting on his wrist in plain view. "You didn't mean for it to go this far," I said quietly, "but you meant for it to start." Tears slid down her cheeks. She clutched at the doorframe, begging for a kindness I no longer owed. I let her sob. I let her feel the weight of what she had chosen. Then I spoke steady and final. "You had my loyalty, Brooke. You traded it for scraps. Now you have nothing." I closed the door, her cries muffled against the night air. Days later, the official call came. Detective Alan Pierce from the Financial Crimes Unit reached out, his voice clipped but respectful. "Mrs. Whitfield, we'll need your cooperation. Your testimony will help solidify the case against your husband." I agreed, my hands steady as I held the phone. When the day arrived, I walked into the station carrying my folder, the same leather case that had once rested at the podium. Pierce laid out the documents, flipping pages with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. "This is strong," he said simply. "It will hold." Mark's arrest came swiftly. The news stations carried his mugshot, his once proud expression now hollow, his eyes rimmed in red. Wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. The list of charges read longer than the toasts he once delivered with a smirk. He was led away in handcuffs, the same hands that once signed contracts, and poured champagne now bound before flashing cameras. Ava asked me quietly that evening if her father was going to jail. I told her gently, "Yes, he is," and she nodded, her eyes sad but certain. Children can recognize justice even through grief. At home, the air felt lighter, though the silence was still heavy. Brooke vanished from view, swallowed by court dates and headlines that stripped her of the last pieces of her glittering mask. I heard she tried to move in with a cousin out of state, but even there, her name carried too much weight. Mark sat in a cell awaiting trial, his lawyers scrambling, his associates fleeing. Every path they once walked together had turned to ruin. And me, I carried on. I brewed coffee each morning, answered emails, attended Ava's school recital. My life stitched slowly back together. There were no parades, no loud declarations, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the same crowd who once laughed at my humiliation had witnessed their downfall. Their mockery had become their undoing. One evening, as I folded laundry, I thought back to that night at the gala when Mark held Brooke's hand aloft like a crown. The image no longer stung. It was simply a reminder of the arrogance that blinded them both. They believed the applause was theirs forever. They never noticed me watching, steady, patient, waiting for the moment to rise. The story wasn't finished yet. Trials lay ahead, and the public unraveling of their reputations would continue. But the balance had shifted. The ground they once claimed as theirs had collapsed, and I stood firmly where they thought I would never remain upright, unbroken, and ready for the final chapter. The weeks after Mark's arrest unfolded quietly for me. Reporters filled the news with headlines and photographs, lawyers fought over statements, and Brooke vanished into courtrooms where her sequins were replaced by gray suits. Yet in my home life settled into something calmer. I brewed coffee each morning, folded laundry, and drove Ava to school, the rhythm of ordinary days, reminding me that survival isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply waking up and knowing the storm has passed. I watched from a distance as Mark and Brooke turned on each other, each desperate to shift blame. Their voices, once joined in mockery, now accused and contradicted. Their letters and emails revealed piece by piece. What they had built together was no longer partnership, it was mutual destruction. And for once, none of it touched me. I wasn't the one being measured, compared, or laughed at. I was free of their stage. My father stopped by often, bringing groceries or sitting at the kitchen table with his newspaper. One afternoon, he looked at me and said, "Lo, you carry yourself different now." I smiled because he was right. The weight that once pressed against my chest was gone. Where humiliation had lived, there was only clarity. He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt my shoulders ease. Ava asked fewer questions about her father as the months wore on. She focused on her music, her friends, the pieces of teenage life that should fill a 15-year-old's days. I shielded her as best I could, reminding her that her worth had nothing to do with the choices of others. Watching her play piano one evening, her fingers steady on the keys, I realized my revenge hadn't been only for me. It was for her too. So she would know a woman doesn't vanish just because others try to erase her. Melissa, the attorney who had first warned me, remained an ally. Over coffee, she said, "You know, you could have walked away quietly. No one would have blamed you." I nodded, but silence was never really an option. If I had walked away, they would have written the ending for me, and that wasn't the lesson I wanted to leave behind. By the time Mark stood trial, I no longer felt anger. The sight of him in court, hollow and restless, didn't bring joy, only confirmation. Justice had stepped in where arrogance once stood. Brooke, too, faced her share of consequences. I heard she tried to rebuild elsewhere, but reputation follows you when it's carved by your own choices. Neither of them held power anymore, and that was enough. Closure doesn't arrive in applause or headlines. It comes in smaller ways, in the sound of Ava's laughter drifting down the hall in the quiet evenings when I read by lamplight, in the peace of drinking coffee without dread. Dignity isn't given back by others. It's reclaimed piece by piece when you refuse to disappear. Looking back, I see now that betrayal didn't end me. It revealed me. It showed me how much strength can live in silence, how patience can carry more power than rage. And it reminded me that even when others mock or dismiss us, we always hold the final choice of how the story ends. So I closed their chapter without bitterness. I didn't forgive them, but I no longer carried them. They had mocked me in public, tried to strip me of my worth, and in the end, they mocked themselves. I remained standing where they thought I'd never stand, unbroken, steady, and free. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've walked through betrayal yourself, may this story remind you that your dignity is always yours to reclaim.